Hello again and welcome back to the channel. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at the biochemistry of aerobic respiration. We're going to be taking a closer look at how the different stages interact with each other and what molecules are made at which stages. So it's going to be split into the following sections. The first one is what's ATP and what's its function in cells. Basically, why do we need ATP? Then we're going to look at some examples of the cellular processes for which ATP is required. And then we'll go on to the four main stages of aerobic respiration. And in this lesson, because this is the first half of two, we're going to look at glycolysis, and then we're going to look at the link reaction. So let's have a look. Okay, so on the first page of the worksheet, which you have a link to in the description below, we start off by talking about what ATP is. So ATP is short for a longer name, which is adenosine triphosphate. Okay, so that's what ATP stands for. You've also got there a diagram that shows how ATP works. And in essence, it cycles between ADP and ATP. And ADP has 2 phosphate groups attached, whereas ATP has 3. So in order to store energy in the molecule, a new bond is made with a phosphate group and ADP. And to get the energy back, you break the bond in ATP, releasing ADP, a phosphate group, and the required energy. And it's a bit like a rechargeable battery. What do I mean? Basically, a rechargeable battery enables you to store energy and to release it when you need it. It's the same sort of thing with ATP. It's like the cell's rechargeable batteries. Okay, so on page 2, you've got a graphic that takes you through some of the different processes, cellular processes, which require ATP. So let's list some of those. I'll put down 3, and you can have a go at putting down 2 of your own. So some examples are muscle contraction, you've also got heat generation, and another example is biosynthesis, or what you could describe as anabolic processes. So let's describe what each of those are and why they require ATP. So in muscle contraction, you've got various fibers that slide over each other, and you need ATP in order to cause the release of certain molecules in the process. So ATP is required for this. Okay, and then heat generation is another use of energy in cells and tissues. So also requires ATP. And then anabolic processes. So the ATP actually supplies the energy to make new bonds. So ATP supplies energy for new bonds. Okay, so those are 3 examples of uses of ATP. From the graphic that I've given you, have a go at trying to put down 2 more in your own time. Okay, so now let's go on to the next stage. Let's think about the 4 stages involved in aerobic respiration. Let's start off at the beginning with something called glycolysis. And then after glycolysis, you've got the link reaction. After the link reaction, you've got something called the Krebs cycle. And then finally, you've got oxidative phosphorylation. So those are the 4 main stages in aerobic respiration. At the bottom of that page, you've got a diagram that shows the structure of a mitochondrion. So you've got an example of a cell there, which is a neuron, and then it zooms in on an individual mitochondrion. As you can see, within the mitochondrion, you've got a folded inner membrane. That inner membrane increases the surface area available for some of the stages of respiration. And that inner membrane being folded forms structures called cristae. We'll talk more about that later, probably in part 2 of this video. So, as usual, there's also a link there which you can view in your own time, which will take you to another helpful video on the structure of mitochondria. So now let's talk about glycolysis and what the purpose of glycolysis is. So number 1, glycolysis from the Greek means to split glucose. Okay, so in this case, you're going to be splitting glucose into 2 molecules of pyruvate. So it splits glucose into 2 molecules of pyruvate. And then, as well as producing 2 molecules of pyruvate per molecule of glucose, it also generates some ATP directly and something called reduced NAD. Now, in this process, we talk about using reduced NAD because that is the specific molecule that is used here. In photosynthesis, a similar molecule called NADP is used. It's easy to remember that because photosynthesis starts with a P, NADP ends with a P. Whereas NAD is the molecule that's used in respiration. So don't mix those 2 up. Okay, so where does glycolysis take place in a cell? Glycolysis takes place in the cytoplasm of cells. So cytoplasm of cells. And how does glucose enter the cytoplasm of cells? Usually it happens either by facilitated diffusion or by active transport. So facilitated diffusion or active transport, depending on the cell type. Okay, so if we go down to the bottom of that page, you've got a diagram that takes you through the steps in glycolysis. It seems quite complicated, but the main takeaway is that you end up splitting a 6-carbon molecule, glucose, into 2 3-carbon molecules, pyruvate. And other molecules are generated along the way, ATP and reduced NAD. So let's write this down. So what molecules are required in glycolysis? The most obvious is glucose. You also need ADP and phosphate groups. And then finally, you need NAD. We'll talk about what NAD stands for in part 2 of this video. Now let's think about what's generated. As I said before, you start off with glucose, which has 6 carbons, and then you end up with pyruvate, which has 3 carbons. You also end up with ATP, and you end up with reduced NAD. So those are the molecules which are generated. So let's now go on to the second stage of aerobic respiration, which is called the link reaction. So the main product of glycolysis is pyruvate. Sometimes you'll come across it being called pyruvic acid. It's the same thing, it's just a different name for the same molecule. And it is a molecule with a lot of chemical potential energy. Okay, so in aerobic respiration, which requires oxygen, that's what makes it aerobic. Anaerobic does not require oxygen, and you can go back to the introduction video on respiration to see all of that in detail. In aerobic respiration, which requires oxygen, pyruvate is transported actively into the mitochondria and is used in the link reaction. So now let's look at what the link reaction looks like. So remember we started off with pyruvate, which has 3 carbons per molecule. So pyruvate is our starting point. Then we have a process which results in the formation of something called acetyl coenzyme A. So acetyl coenzyme A, and that has 2 carbons. So something must have happened in between. Can you figure out what that something is? Basically, you must have released a carbon atom, and that carbon atom is going to be released within carbon dioxide. But as well as releasing the carbon atom, you're going to have to release the hydrogen atoms that were attached to it. So in order to transport those, you attach them to NAD, and that's what causes the NAD to become reduced NAD. So by attaching hydrogen atoms to NAD, you end up with reduced NAD. So what is or are the main reasons for the link reaction? Let's think about that. So number one, it breaks off a carbon atom. So you're further breaking down the molecule you started off with. So removes a carbon atom from pyruvate. But as well as doing that, it generates reduced NAD, which is required for one of the later processes in respiration, oxidative phosphorylation. And we'll talk more about that later. So it generates reduced NAD. And NAD actually stands for nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. So let's make my writing a little bit smaller to fit it all in. So nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. Okay, so that's what the purpose is of the link reaction. So let's make that a bit clearer. Oops. Let's have another go at that. So let's just move this a bit so that you can see the entire spelling. Okay, so NAD stands for nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. Okay, so earlier I mentioned anaerobic respiration, and anaerobic respiration does not require oxygen. However, it also is less efficient, so you end up with fewer ATP molecules per molecule of glucose used. And it also generates toxins. In animals, it generates a toxin called lactic acid, which can lead to cramps, or in more serious situations, something called lactic acidosis, which can be very, very problematic. And in plants and yeast, it ends up generating alcohol or ethanol in fermentation. Now, those aren't the only two pathways. Some other organisms actually generate totally different molecules, but in most cases, those molecules are toxic to the organisms that generate them. So in the case of anaerobic respiration, the point is that because you can't continue on with any of the further processes in aerobic respiration, it causes all of the processes to stop unless you can do something that enables at least some of it to continue. And what happens here in both of those is that you can regenerate fresh NAD, which can then be used in glycolysis. So at least glycolysis continues and it generates a small amount of ATP. So the benefit is to regenerate NAD for glycolysis. Okay, that's where we're going to stop in part 1 of this process of looking through the biochemistry of aerobic respiration. So let's do a summary of what we've done so far. So here's a summary of what we've done so far. First, we looked at ATP, which stands for adenosine triphosphate, and we talked about it as an energy currency in cells. What do I mean by an energy currency? It's basically the molecule that's used by cells as a store of energy for cellular processes. Then we talked about some examples of the cellular processes which require ATP. For instance, muscle contraction, which is required for movement. It's also required for anabolic processes, which build up complex molecules from simpler ones. And as such, the ATP provides the energy to form new bonds in these larger, more complex molecules. Also, it's required for things like active transport. And then we talked about the fact that aerobic respiration actually has 4 stages. And the reason why it has 4 stages is to slow the process down so that energy isn't released too quickly. And that means that you can generate ATP because the energy is slowly being stored in the bonds rather than being released all at once, which would be catastrophic. It would release too much energy, and that could literally cause your tissue fluids to boil. So let's have a look. So the 4 main stages of aerobic respiration, we started off with glycolysis. Then you go to the link reaction. And so those first 2 are the ones we've talked about so far. And then you go on to something called the Krebs cycle, which we'll talk about in the next video. And then you finish off with something called oxidative phosphorylation. So let's talk about the first 2 and where they occur. Glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm of cells. Most of the rest of the processes occur in the mitochondria. And so the next step, the link reaction, happens in the mitochondrial matrix. Okay, so those are the 4 main stages. Then we focused on the first 2 stages. So we started off with glycolysis. And glycolysis, as the name suggests, glycolysis, glyco for sugar or glucose in this case, and lysis means to split or cleave. Glycolysis is the splitting of glucose, a 6-carbon molecule, into 2 3-carbon molecules called pyruvate or pyruvic acid. So that's one of the key reasons or the key functions of glycolysis. Along the way, it also generates a small amount of ATP and reduced NAD, which is used later in the process to generate more ATP. We'll talk more about that in part 2. And then the next stage we looked at, which finished off the main body of this video, was a link reaction. And the link reaction, as the name suggests, is actually the link between glycolysis and the next step, which is called the Krebs cycle. What is the point of the link reaction? It breaks off a carbon atom from pyruvate, which is another step in breaking down glucose. And as well as breaking off the carbon, it also produces reduced NAD. So that reduced NAD can then be used later on, as I said, to generate more ATP later. Okay, so that's the link reaction. And the product of that is something called acetyl coenzyme A, which is a 2-carbon molecule. It is acetyl coenzyme A, which can then move on to the next stage, which is the Krebs cycle, which we'll talk about in part 2. And so that's our summary of the biochemistry of aerobic respiration. I hope you found that useful. If you did, please click on the like button below, and you can also subscribe if you haven't already in order to get notified when new videos are added. Of course, it's always very helpful if you can also add any questions you might have in the comments section. And at some point, I'll be able to compile those questions and then come up with more videos to deal with any questions that you might have. I hope you found that all very useful and informative, and I'll see you in the next video.